Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. This video is going to be a response video. Logan, who has the YouTube channel Metal and Beer Snob, which is a fantastic name for a channel, recently he posted a video talking about the time frame of 2012 to 2016 and how he was thinking that was kind of a renaissance in extreme metal. And he laid out a lot of points, about why he thought this, that kind of, supported, what he referred to as his hypothesis that extreme metal, heavy metal overall, but extreme metal in particular, kind of went through this renaissance period during those 5 years. And it was a really well done video. And I thought it was very interesting because it's a time period where I was not very connected to what was happening in current heavy metal releases. It's a time where I was getting a new job and a lot more responsibility. Was also dealing with things like, trying to buy a house, trying to start a family, doing lots of, sort of, big adult stuff, which meant I didn't have time to keep up with, every heavy metal album coming out and every new band that was popping up. So watching Logan's video, yeah, I didn't really have a strong feeling of whether I agreed with it or whether I didn't agree with it. It's like, okay, he makes some very good points. Maybe metal did kind of go through a bit of a revival and, resurgence during those 5 years. At the same time, one thing, that's missing from Logan's video is some context. It's like, well, what are we comparing it to? We've got this 5 year period, and he points out a lot of stuff from those 5 years, but um, it kind of implies that prior to those 5 years, metal maybe was in a bit of a lull, or at least was kind of, just on average. Things were kind of on par. And that the 5 year period he was looking at saw a lot more activity in certain areas. So I figured I'd, do what a scientist does, since that is my day job. I would test his hypothesis and try to see, did metal really go through sort of a resurgence from 2012 to 2016? Or, are there some biases in Logan's video and his take on it that kind of just make it seem to him like there was a big resurgence at that time? Something I want to be very clear about at the start. I'm not setting out to challenge Logan's hypothesis. I'm not trying to prove that he's wrong or anything like that. I've been on a couple of live streams with Logan. He's been on Heavy Metallurgy a couple of times with us. Really great guy. Like him quite a bit. He's very thoughtful and knows his stuff very well. This is not a video to, see who is right or who is wrong. He had an interesting idea. I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with his idea. So I just kind of want to test it out and see what I can come up with in terms of some additional data that might support his idea and be like, wow, yeah, seems like there was a big resurgence here in those 5 years. Or maybe some data I can throw out there might point in the other direction, be like, actually, I don't know if there was that big of a difference in those 5 years or not. That's all I'm trying to do here. This is not, trying to make anybody look bad or, throw down any kind of gauntlet and declare, you are wrong, you don't know what you're talking about. Not at all the point of this. I had honestly, again, no idea where this would go when I started trying to compile some information for it. But I'll go through some things. This is going to be a video where I'm not going to show a lot of albums because there's tons of albums I want to talk about. Instead, we're going to look at what scientists look at way, way too often every day, spreadsheet. So let's go over here to share screen option and look at what Logan's points were and kind of compare them to some stuff that I came up with. All right. So again, Logan had sort of like 4 lines of evidence that he put forward to support his idea that this 5 year period had kind of a resurgence in heavy metal. And what I wanted to do was kind of, think about those for the 5 year period prior to that. So what I set up here, the part of the spreadsheet that's highlighted in yellow over here, these are this is the information that Logan proposed for 2012 to 2016. And I've added some information to that to kind of help, bolster his data set. And then over here on the other side of the black line is information for his same kind of 4 lines of reasoning that I've come up with for the 5 years prior. So 2007 to 2011. And so we'll compare and contrast and kind of see where things line up. All right. Another thing to point out, I guess, before we get started here is that, there may be some individual biases, not only from Logan, but definitely from me in how these things are put together. And I'll try to point out some of those instances as we go. This is not calculus. There's a certain art, a lot of subjectivity to this. So yeah, it's not a perfect comparison. And I, realize that, but still want to make it clear right from the get-go. All right. Logan's first point about why he thought there was a resurgence in metal during 2012 to 2016 is, he felt like there were some very big comeback albums, some kind of, big bands releasing some really strong bounce back albums, and especially within death metal. So he came up with the examples that are listed here in black. So just kind of a quick review, and you can certainly go watch Logan's video to see him walk through these. But Carcass Surgical Steel was a huge one that he mentioned. I would agree. Gorguts came back with Colored Sands. Cannibal Corpse released Torture. Enslaved had the, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, like RITTIR album. Overkill with Electric Age. Summoning with Old Morning's Dawn. Creator with Phantom Antichrist, and Suffocation with Pinnacle of Bedlam. So yeah, there's some good examples there. There's a couple of examples I'm not sure I agree with, and I'll just mention those briefly. Some more just information about what you're looking at. The ones that are kind of in the bold face here, those are the ones that are, the death metal examples. So definitely worth noting that Logan pointed out, some things that were not just extreme metal examples. He gave examples from other styles too. So I just used bold to indicate the death metal ones. Yeah, I think his first couple of examples are very good ones. Carcass and Gorguts for sure. Yeah, Cannibal Corpse, Torture may be a very, very good album from them, but Cannibal had not been on any real hiatus at that point. The previous album had come out just a couple of years before that. So it's a big release for them, perhaps, a really strong release from them, perhaps, but it's not a comeback album. They hadn't, gone away at any point. But, I'm willing to leave it on the list. And I think Logan was also trying to make the point that not all these meant that the band had to be gone for 10 years or anything, just that, you had big bands releasing really top-notch albums, some of which were comeback albums. So we're going to leave Cannibal on the list. Enslaved, kind of the same thing. Enslaved hadn't gone anywhere. They had been releasing albums consistently, but Logan feels this was a big one for them. So I left it on the list. I just added the question marks because I did want to point out that these weren't comeback albums the way we typically think of an album being a comeback. The bands had not disappeared and then returned to the scene. Same with Overkill's Electric Age. That's an excellent album. I agree. It's a top-notch one from that time frame. But Overkill had been releasing things very steadily for years ahead of that. All right, so that's Logan's list, and he had 4 entries that were death metal with Carcass, Gorguts, Cannibal Corpse, and Suffocation. Oh, I did have a note down here about the Suffocation one. I'm not familiar with that band's catalog whatsoever. They lean a little more brutal than I care for in my death metal typically. I did notice that on Metal Archives, Pinnacle of Bedlam is the second lowest rated album in the Suffocation discography. Metal Archives, you got to take with a big grain of salt when it comes to the review scores. A very, very big, like honking crystal sized piece of salt. But I wanted to point this out because, again, there may be some personal biases in here. This may be one of, Logan's favorite Suffocation albums. He may have it up there on this kind of top tier. I don't really know if the metal community at large would agree with that or not. So I just wanted to point out that, yeah, there may be disagreements on some of these albums. Some people may not have Cannibal Corpse's Torture that high. Again, I don't know. I'm not very familiar with that album. The ones here in red, these are ones I added. I went through and looked for more stuff that would kind of, bolster his argument. Another one, huge comeback at the time was At the Gates, At War with Reality. Now, that album is not liked as much, say, as Carcass's Surgical Steel, but it was a huge comeback. This was a big band, and people were very hyped for it coming back. And I guess it is the best album they've done since they came back. The competition for that title is not very strong, but nevertheless, it was a huge comeback album in that time period. Same with Cathedral doing The Last Spire, which was their last album, but people were really jazzed that they came back for another album. All right. Fate's Warning, Darkness in a Different Light. They had not released an album for about 9 years prior to this. And the last one or two albums they did before this hiatus were not among their strongest. I think even most hardcore Fate's Warning fans would admit that they hit a little bit of a lull on a couple of albums there in the earliest 2000s. But Darkness in a Different Light saw a revamped lineup deliver a really strong album. Now, again, this is not an extreme metal example. Um, but not all the examples Logan gave originally were extreme metal examples either. So I think it's fair to go ahead and include it here. Running Wild, Rapid Foray, this was their best album in years. They had taken some time off. They had released some dud albums. Rapid Foray saw a bit of a return to form for that band. So there's another big band with a pretty good comeback record. Same for St. Vitus doing Lily 365. They hadn't released an album since the mid 90s. They came back with Wino on vocals, and yeah, this is a very, very good album from them. And the last example I came up with was the band Satan with Life Sentence. This was their first album since 1987. This was an extremely well-received comeback album. A lot of people felt like it was one of the band's strongest efforts. And so, again, another kind of, semi-legendary band from the past, showing back up in this 5-year time frame that Logan's interested in, and delivering an album that a lot of people were very hyped on. So yeah, we add all of those up, and we've got about 14 examples of strong sort of comeback albums in that 5-year time frame. So that's just Logan thinking about it and myself. Other people might come up with other examples that both of us have missed. But yeah, seems like a pretty good number. So how does that compare to the 5-year period beforehand? Well, again, that's going to be the columns that are over here in this kind of tan color. And this is just me thinking about these 5 years. So this isn't, Logan didn't attack or Logan didn't really tackle this 5-year period. So this is just what I came up with. So some big comebacks in the 2007 to 2011 window. First off, Accept returned with Blood of the Nations. This was their first album since back in the 90s. This is their first album, with their new vocalist on board, and it is very strong. It was very impressive. A lot of folks weren't sure what to expect, and it really delivered. Anathema released We're Here Because We're Here. This was their first album since earlier in the 2000s. They had a release in between, but it's like a covers album or something. It wasn't really new studio original material, so I don't count that. I don't even remember what it's called offhand. But We're Here Because We're Here. It sees the band really step into their post-rock phase, whatever you want to call it, post something. And deliver a really dazzling album. And this is a band, again, kind of like Fate's Warning. The albums they had done in the early 2000s, some fans really enjoy those, other fans not so much. At that time, it kind of felt like they were almost trying to out Pink Floyd on a couple of things, like A Natural Disaster and A Fine Day to Exit. We're Here Because We're Here leaves that period behind. Anathema gets a very different, kind of post sound, and they make some really beautiful music. So I think that's a good entry here. John Arch comes out of retirement here and does the Arch Matheos first album, Sympathetic Resonance. And that one, of course, that's a huge comeback for fans of traditional metal. Again, not extreme metal here, but like I said, Logan had some non-extreme stuff in his list, so I didn't really make that a complete qualifier. But yeah, Arch Matheos, that's a huge return. On the extreme metal side of things, Varg Vikernes returned with Burzum after the end of his incarceration and released his first comeback album, Bellas. And this was another example where folks really weren't sure what he was going to do. What's this going to sound like? But of course, folks were curious, and a lot of folks felt like it was a fairly solid album. Does it live up to the glories of his very early stuff? No. Was it a disaster? Did he go off and make electronic music? No. It's like, okay, that's actually not bad. Cynic, Florida tech legends returned and released Traced in Air. And again, it was very warmly received. Danzig released his best received album in years with Death Red Sabbath. You know, from Danzig 5 up through what, Danzig 8 or 9, those albums didn't always elicit a very good reaction from fans. Danzig, was trying out some different things. A lot of folks weren't into it. But this particular album felt like, again, a little bit of a return to form. People were a lot more happy with it. Caught a lot of people off guard. They weren't expecting a really good Danzig album at that time. Testament came back after 7 years. I think this is when Chuck had health issues, but they came back on Nuclear Blast with Formation of Damnation, a really really good album. Um, Testament hadn't necessarily hit a lull prior to this, again, but this is just an example of, more of the comeback scenario where there was a large number of years and they come back and they nail it. And I put Overkill's Ironbound here. I think this is the album a lot of people think of as their big bounce back album, not come back in terms of, again, they were gone, but come back to their core classic sound. Marty, Darcy, and I talked about the Overkill discography recently on Heavy Metallurgy. And there's a period there, like, in the late 90s up to about this point with Ironbound, where some of their albums are okay, but some of them are kind of boring. They got very into the groove metal thing. Some of the albums were uninspired, but Ironbound was the one that, really kind of signaled we are back. So tally those up, and we've got about 8 examples of comeback albums from the 2007 to 2011 timeframe. So it's definitely less than what Logan and I had come up with for 2012 to 2016. But again, this is just my list. With some help from Logan or someone else, this list would probably be bigger. One difference between the two lists is that, there's not any death metal flat out on my list. Cynic may have started as a death metal band and part of the Florida death metal scene. I don't think it's fair to call Traced in Air a death metal album. Burzum is an extreme metal album, but it's black metal. We've got a couple of thrash metal albums that could be considered extreme, but not death metal. So I didn't come up with anything that I thought of was an absolute sort of big comeback death metal release. So in that sense, Logan might be correct based on this very limited sort of sampling of albums. He came up with some very solid examples for death metal in those 5 years. The previous 5 years, I could not come up with any really solid death metal examples, but maybe with the help of others, there are some things that I've overlooked. All right, so that was Logan's first point. I think there are a lot of good comeback albums in the 5 years prior to his time frame, maybe just not so much in death metal. All right, on down the spreadsheet we go to point 2. Second point was that there were some very key reissues in those 5 years. He only cited one example, but it was a very good one and a very big one. That's when the Death discography started getting reissued once Relapse, had acquired the rights to it and put out most of the classic Death LPs. And his point was, this introduced a younger generation to Death, made it easier for them to really kind of dive into that band's catalog. And it's safe to say at this point, Death, they achieved legendary status a long time ago. But this kind of cements that they have that same status with a younger group of folks. It's not just the boomers from the late 80s and early 90s metal scene talking up Death. It's Logan and his generation, the younger folks that are like, yes, on this we can agree. We think that band is every bit as important as the generation that came before us ranks them. So that's a good example for sure. And looking at 2007 to 2011, I did come up with one comparable example. And that was when we saw the release of the Hellhammer box set Demon Entrails. And that, for the first time, really got all the Hellhammer material together in one place. Hellhammer didn't have a lot of original releases, but they had some very influential demos, and they had been bootlegged over and over, and a lot of people had heard them, but there had never really been nice recordings of them with all the material gathered up. So when Demon Entrails came out, that was a huge deal. People were really, excited to have all the Hellhammer stuff finally brought together, put together into a nice package. And, at that point, you could really see, like, okay, Hellhammer, yes, there was a lot of material here, and it really did have a big influence on a lot of people and a lot of bands. Even though they only had one official EP in their original run, plus a couple of songs on a compilation. The Demon Entrails reissue, that was a huge thing for extreme metal in the 2007 to 2011 timeframe. Right. So again, there's only one example here from each. Reissues are kind of a tricky thing to qualify because sometimes albums are reissued very regularly, sometimes there's big gaps. It's also something that the metal scene itself doesn't have much control over. This isn't like saying, oh, there's a bunch of new bands out. It's really more up to like, when do labels feel like reissuing things? Or with the Death example, when does a label get the rights to material so that they can reissue things? So I don't know if I would include this as something that, on its own could help, be a big factor in a metal renaissance. But I definitely get Logan's point that all of a sudden these very important classic, songs and material were available to people who were active on the scene at that time. So for point two, we got one strong example from each of those 5-year blocks. All right, moving on to Logan's third line of evidence. And let's see, I think I've got to adjust the window here a little bit. Yeah, this list's a bit longer. Um, Logan's third point was that he felt there were a lot of unique, he used the phrase future classics that were released during that 5-year window. The examples he gave are listed over here again in black. He cited an album by Ne Obviscaris. The second one he mentioned the video, I could not quite catch the name of the band. I watched it back a couple of times. I never did quite figure it out. It sounded like Sabrosa. I think he said it was more of a stoner type band. Um, I'm not familiar with these two albums at all. And that's why I put question marks next to them. This is another point where individual bias could come up a lot. These two albums are obviously very important to Logan, and that's cool. The Nev Obfuscaris one sounded interesting. I want to try to check that one out when I get a chance. But other people might completely disagree. So I think there are some, though, we can agree that, were a big deal and are still hailed by at least a relatively large number of metalheads as being a big deal. Good example, that was Logan's third example, Paul Bearer's Foundations of Burden. That was a big album when it came out. The debut had set expectations pretty high. This album really delivered. Migwa's Exercises in Futility. That was a huge deal when it came out. It got a lot of hype, a lot of circulation, and a lot of people got into the band on that album. Here's an example. Personally, I prefer the one that came before that, just a little bit more. What is that one called? With Hearts Towards None, I think. But yeah, this is the album that was had more of an impact on the scene, I think. And the last example that Logan gave for this category was Alcest's Kodama album. Alcest, yeah, has had a lot of impacts on heavy metal over this whole time frame in general. I don't know the Kodama album. I think it's the only one by them I haven't heard. Nah, there's probably at least one or two others I haven't heard. But anyway, I'm certainly not going to challenge it or take it off his list or anything. In fact, I'm going to add to his list. The titles over here in red, these are ones that, I found that I would think also deserve a place here. First off, Batushka's Liturgia album. This one got a ton of attention when it came out. It had, that kind of, relatively unique sort of, Eastern Orthodox black metal vibe going on. People loved that album to death. Unfortunately, the band fell apart due to infighting almost instantly, so we never got a proper follow-up to it. Each guy went and tried to do his own album, and neither of them are, anywhere close to this. But yeah, As such, I think this album's gotten forgotten a little bit, but definitely, kind of, classic at the time. Behemoth's The Satanist came out in that time frame. I would have figured Logan would have had that on his list because I know he likes that album a lot. But yeah, this is an album that if Behemoth weren't already, on the map, this one really cemented their place as, a big name heavy metal act. Blood Incantations Starspawn came out in this time frame. Folks really dig that album. It's not, their first material. Maybe, they're a little better known for Hidden History. I'm not sure. But I think you could make a strong case for putting Starspawn on here. And I know Blood Incantations become one of those bands that's a little bit popular to piss on because they're not sticking to true death metal conventions. Oh my God, what do we do? They don't just play blast beats all the time. I think they're still doing excellent music. If it's a bit different, maybe they're just trying to stay ahead of the pack and not get swallowed up in the sea of other sound-alike death metal bands. That's probably a good thing. Um, let's see. The next one up now, Rick mentioned this in his response video. He also responded to Logan's video over on his channel, The Dreadful Minutes. You can go check out his video too. Caladan Brood, Echoes of Battle. And this one is strong summoning worship, but it's extremely good. It's the only album the band did. And it's definitely kind of earned its place as one of the classics that came out here in the early 2010s. Other ones I thought of that we should add to the list. Cults de Gauls, Henbane. That record, got a lot of press around the time it came out. A lot of people were talking it up. It's one that made it onto, my radar somehow. And again, this is a time frame when not many things even got on my radar, and I kept seeing things about this album. It's like, oh, okay, let's at least see what all the fuss is about. Morbus Cron, next, Sleepers in the Rift. This one's become a bit of an underground favorite over the years. Another band I don't think they really got a chance to do a lot of follow-up material, but I hear this album, referenced, yeah, not daily or anything, but it keeps coming up over the years as, an album that people are really impressed with or had an influence on and other things. Let's see. Rick also pointed out Panopticon's Kentucky. I think that's a no-brainer to be on this type of list. A huge influence there on kind of the Americana version of the black metal with, the bluegrass instrumentation and such worked in really well. Ruins of Bevrast, Blood Vaults. This is usually cited as one of the band's strongest albums, so that could easily be on this kind of list. Vector, Terminal Redux. Again, obviously Vector, had, issues come up with, behavior. Regardless of what you think of that, this, was a bigger album. It was their first time getting circulated to a wider audience, and yeah, had a huge impact, I think, for them in that scene. And the last one I thought of was Witchcraft's Legend album. Now this is a good example of one. I wouldn't include this on the list based on my own personal tastes, but I know there's a fair number of people who do consider that to be, an excellent top shelf album from this time frame. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and add it to the list too. So that means between Logan's list and the stuff I added, there's about 15 albums that we've got sort of considered as future classics. So pretty strong list. When I looked at the years 2007 to 2011, I came up with 14 on my own. So we'll run through those. I'll make a quick comment about each. Again, there may be some personal biases here. Feel free to, agree or disagree, make comments. Add a comment down below if there's anything that you think should be added or something you think should be taken off. This list isn't carved in stone or anything. It's flexible. It can be adjusted. One that I thought of was Woods of Ypres 3, the Green Album. This one, again, stirred up, a lot of attention when it came out. It's one I didn't check out when it came out, but I know I kept seeing it on forum posts and zines and everything. Abigor, Time is the Sulfur in the Veins of the Saint. Here's one that I may be a little biased on. I think this is an amazing album that definitely deserves to be considered sort of a modern classic. I don't know if the metal community at large holds it in that same regard. Not even sure a ton of people have heard the album. So maybe that one should not be on the list, and that's just on Alan's personal list. Droop, Microcosmos. This one is tied for their highest rated on Metal Archives. Now, I talked about how we have to approach Metal Archives reviews earlier. But yeah, I remember it made a good impression and kind of a big splash when it came out. it seems to have gotten a lot of very favorable reviews over time. There's a star there because there's technically the newest Druk album has a higher rating, but it just came out last year. It only has 2 reviews, so there's not much data to go on there. Gates of Slumber, Hymns of Blood and Thunder. This may be another personal bias. I think that deserves to be on the list of classics from 2007 to 2011. Hour of 13. I think you could pick at least one of their first 2 albums. This is one I never got that into. I always found them a little bit generic, but a ton of people really love that band. So I think one of their albums would be on this list. Ludacra, The Tenant. Now, this is another one I have not quite been able to get into this album, but other folks consider it a big, big staple in American black metal. So, like, okay, yeah, if many people think, consider it that way, I'll put it on the list. Mayhem, Ordo ad Chaos, big release from Mayhem in this time frame. Mournful Congregation, the June Frost. This is one that gets revered by many folks, and so it seemed like it should be on the list. It is a very good album. This one I would agree with. Noctmistium released black metal parts 1 and 2, the Addicts and Assassins albums. I think these should be on the list. A lot of people might disagree. I think the Noctmistium catalog gets a bit of extra shit because of people's perceptions of Blake Judd. I get it. The guy ripped a lot of people off, and that's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth. If we're just looking for classic albums, though, yeah, these two, were big releases at their time. They got good reviews, good reception from fans, and they really did things to kind of, start pushing black metal into some different directions away from just, raw copycat black and white, bad photocopied black metal. So I think they do deserve to be on the list. Ruins of Bevrest's Phallus Semen of a Sheltered Elite. Again, I think you can make a big case for that as a classic from that time frame. Septic Flesh's Communion. Now, this one, has a different sound than their earlier albums, but it seems to be, based on what I've read on different, reviews and websites, it seems to be the one album from the later part of Septic Flesh's history that a lot of folks agree is like, okay, here they kind of really nailed that sound. So worth considering for this kind of list. Seventh Wonder, Mercy Falls. This is a progressive metal band from Sweden. This album made a lot of waves when it came out in those circles. Not extreme metal whatsoever. We've already covered that point before. But yeah, this one really helped put that band on the map as a leader in progressive metal for the rest of, the late 2000s and into the 2010s. You had Titan Blood, Seven Chalices. This one's cited by a lot of folks, as a huge example of war metal. I know the album, I'm not real familiar with it, but yeah, I've heard enough other people talk it up that I feel like it could be on the list. And let's see, we got one last one there. Watain Sworn to the Dark. I think that's one of the albums that really helped cement them as a big draw in black metal. I might be wrong about that. It's not a band I'm that nuts about. They're okay. Maybe they were already a big deal, and this was just another fairly well-known release from them. So again, you could probably take a few things off this list. You could probably add a few things to it that I didn't notice. But the bottom line is I'm seeing kind of, a similar number. My list has 14 albums. The list from Logan's time frame has, 15 albums with his records and the ones I added to his list. So in terms of unique future classics, first impression is that it's about the same for the two. That there's not a ton more unique future classics from Logan's 5-year period than there were in the previous 5 years. All right, on to point number 4. This is the last one that Logan made. He felt that a lot of sort of, heavy metal genres got a shot in the arm at the time. That some of these, his phrase was classic genres got revitalized. And again, especially death metal. So the death metal entries will be boldface on the lists. The examples that Logan gave for this, the band Chemists, their debut, he felt, was kind of a big deal for the doom scene. One thing to point out before I go further down this list, there could definitely be some bleed over between like this category and some of the other categories we've already talked about. Like, does that Chemist album really reinvigorate Doom? You might argue that, but maybe you then put it on that list of like, future classic albums instead. So there's, again, wiggle room. Some of these titles might end up, maybe they belong with Logan's third point instead of fourth point. I'm not going to nitpick and try to, change them out. I'm representing the list exactly the way Logan put it forward. Eternal Champion, their first album, was odd, and I would agree on this one for sure. It's a big shot in the arm for kind of, the epic, just, heavy metal. Logan called it, just heavy metal. I usually refer to it as like, traditional or classic heavy metal, but yeah, your basic, straightforward heavy metal stuff. Eternal Champion's been a boon to that scene for sure. Logan put out, Horrendous, their Anatea album was a shot in the arm for death metal. Okay, yep, a lot of folks hail that album quite a bit. Some other ones I added to his list in red, the first Crypt Sermon album, Out of the Garden. This one can kind of count as, doom and or new wave of traditional heavy metal, but that album was good for both of those scenes. I think, the first Sulfur Eon album, Swallowed by the Ocean's Tide, this again was kind of, getting death metal more interesting again. At least for me, this one may be one that's personal bias. And then the last two I thought of were entries in black metal, Thy Darkened Shades, Liber Lucifer 1, and Thanathaxath's Sacred White Noise. Mm, I'm not familiar with either of these albums. I've only, become aware of these bands with the albums they released last year. But yeah, I've heard enough people in the heavy metal community talk about these albums with very high praise, and pointing out that, yeah, they were helping again push black metal forward. That I felt like they probably deserve to be on this list. But again, this list is sort of about, the genres that we're getting a boost. And so that means with Logan's examples and my examples, we've got doom, traditional metal, death metal. We could say new wave of, traditional heavy metal here. Already said death metal, and then black metal. So about 5 genres that seem to be, having some bands really help, revitalize and, raise the bar for those genres. All right. When I asked that same question about 2007 to 2011, I actually got a larger number over here in the tan area. And again, death metal or ones are highlighted. Part of the reason I've got a higher number here, we can definitely make a case about, how do you split up genres? Is it fair to lump? Should some of these be lumped together, or should some of them be split apart? I don't know. But, here's what I've came up with anyway. Alcest, Esquils de Luna. This is where, they really started developing that post black metal shoegazy type sound. This is, where Alcest was developing the sound they became famous for, that they kind of, in a way, really spearheaded that specific style of black metal. Maybe there were other bands doing something very similar at the same time. Maybe someone beat Alcest to the punch that I am not aware of or that has slipped my mind. But, I think that's, was a huge boost for, and I just referred to it as post black metal as the genre. Amon Amarth released Twilight of the Thunder God. This is a huge release at the time for melodic death metal. Amon Amarth, not a band I'm very interested in. Even I will admit this album's pretty glorious. And the same was true for a lot of people when it came out. This was, the highlight of their career as far as many of us are concerned. So melodic death metal, got a boost here. Dead Congregation, Graves of the Archangels. Kellen and others have talked about this album at length, and, how they felt like it was kind of groundbreaking, helping reestablish death metal as, a serious, dark, and dangerous force. And it came out in this time frame. The Devil's Blood released Time of No Time Evermore. That was their debut album. And that did a lot to start raising the visibility of the whole occult rock thing. I don't know if that's a term other people use very much. I use it to refer to, those 70s bands that were functioning in the same space as like, Coven or Black Widow. They're 70s hard rock bands, sure, but they were definitely trying to play around with that, sort of, darker, spookier imagery a lot. And Devil's Blood, yeah, was a big deal at the time. The band didn't last very long, unfortunately, just two proper studio albums, but yeah, they were made a big splash. Graveyard Sinking Blues. This was a big one for the 70s kind of retro scene. Now again, Graveyard doesn't really go in that occulty direction at all, so I put them in a separate little subgenre. Maybe I should lump both of those just into like 70s revival. Uh, okay, that's a possibility. Portraits. Their album Crimin something something something. I didn't type out the whole title. But this time frame is where you really saw that new wave of traditional heavy metal have several of their staples come out. Portrait's just, kind of the one I chose as a good example of that for that subgenre. Ulcerate, Everything is Fire. I don't know this album by Ulcerate, but a lot of folks that participate, in the YouTube heavy metal community have pointed out, that this album they feel was a huge factor in extreme metal as you were heading into the 2010s. And so those people know what they're talking about. I put it on the list. You could put, Vector's first one, Black Future. This was the first time I feel like that, tech thrash had gotten something really cool and interesting that wasn't named Voivod in a long, long time. If I'm wrong, add a comment below and let me know what was happening in tech thrash around this time that I and others may have missed out on. While Heaven Wept released Vast Oceans Lacrimose, this was a huge thing for traditional metal. People loved this album to death. It was considered a real milestone. The band kind of, drifted and, the lineup got bloated and then they kind of fell apart. So I think this album, again, has gotten a little bit forgotten over the years, but it was a huge boon to traditional heavy metal when it came out around 2009. Witchcraft's The Alchemist. Again, this is another one that for that kind of 70s retro sound was a big deal. People really lost their shit over this album. I really didn't lose my shit over this album or this band, but I'm willing to concede that yes, it was an important album for that style of music. And the last one I put on the list was Wolves in the Throne Room with Two Hunters, their sophomore effort. So yes, they had an album out before this, that came before this time frame, but I think Two Hunters is the one that a lot of folks, that's where they first got introduced to the band. And that's the album they still hold up as, kind of very emblematic of the whole Cascadian black metal style starting to really come into prominence. So I added it there. All right. Now, so again, I had about 10 genres, but again, I'll admit some of these, like I have, post black metal separated from, Cascadian black metal. Am I oversplitting things there a little bit? Perhaps. Perhaps there are other genres from the 2012 to 2016 timeframe that we should have on this list over here in yellow that neither Logan nor myself thought of. Quite possible. But the bottom line is, I think even if we condensed a lot of my genres and kind of packaged them together more, you'd still see a decent number of genres got a boost, including death metal, in the 5 years prior to Logan's time frame. All right, so I've read a lot of stuff from a spreadsheet for a while. What does all this mean when we compare these two areas? Well, both time frames, 2007 to 2011 versus 2012 to 2016, they both saw a lot of bands do good comeback albums. May have been more in Logan's time frame than in quote unquote my time frame. Definitely more death metal examples have come up so far. So, Logan might have a good point that those years, did see a lot of good comebacks, especially in death metal. Yeah, in terms of reissues, that one's really, really hard to quantify. There was at least one key reissue done in each of those 5-year blocks. For the unique future classics, I think you can make a good case that both of these 5-year blocks have plenty of albums, that have gone on to achieve a really strong status as top tier stuff. So I don't know that 2012 to 2016 is really that exceptional for the number of releases they got in this category. But again, this category is also can be strongly biased, and some of these could be shifted to other categories. And then the same, I think, would be true in terms of like, the genres that were getting a boost at this time. Death metal had, some very key releases in both of those periods, but so did other genres too. So at the end of it, I think, Logan's strongest point for 2012, 2016 being a bit of a renaissance might be this first line of evidence he gave. That, the number of bands coming back with really strong albums, especially within death metal, um, based on my very, very limited comparison here, it's like, yeah, that does kind of stand out. The other categories, I think things are maybe more on par. And this again is where biases could come in. Logan mentioned that, these years that he was focusing on was kind of his college years. And I think for a lot of people, those years right after high school, whether you're at college or whether you've got a job and you're working and earning money for the first time, I think those are years where you're more tuned into whatever scene you're interested in. In our case, it's heavy metal. But yeah, that's the time frame where you've got money to spend, perhaps, but you've also got the time and the connections to research and look at those resources and really dig in, whether you're earning money at your job and hitting the record store every weekend, or whether you're sitting in your dorm room downloading tons of stuff and watching a lot of YouTube in between classes when you should be doing homework. You've got the time to invest in it. So that might be part of the reason that, Logan really connects with 2012 to 2016 as, his metal renaissance. It's probably for why a lot of folks who are like, a decade or so older than Logan, like myself, why we connect more with like, late 80s and early 90s, because that's where you're in our high school and post high school years. And we were especially plugged into what was going on. But anyway, that is what I've got for this particular entry. So again, I thought it was a really cool topic that Logan came up with, and it was really interesting for me to kind of dig into those years and see what the lists looked like. Again, there are years where I was distracted with a lot of other life things happening, so not years that I know all that much about. So let's talk metal in the comments down below, and you tell me what I have missed and what I've gotten wrong. Are there more, good examples of death metal, big comebacks from 2007 to 2011? Please add a comment. Or there's some other genres that had a big resurgence from 2012 to 2016 that Logan and I just didn't think about. Please add them in the comments down below. And again, closing thought, yes, there's a lot of bias and subjectivity in this kind of thing. I am not making a case that these are definitive lists or that, Logan's absolutely wrong on this or absolutely right about this. This is just the information I came up with. It was an interesting thought experiment. So a big thank you to Logan for putting out a cool video that got me thinking about some years in heavy metal history that I don't always think about that much, that they're not kind of, in my wheelhouse as much as some other time frames might be. But it's been really interesting digging in, seeing what I could find out. And I'm interested to see what your comments will include that'll kind of add to this particular topic. So next time, I promise no spreadsheet in the video, but it seems like the best way to try to do this particular topic. Anyway, until that next time, everyone take care. And as always, keep banging your head.